Good morning, my name is Miss Tori. I am a Youth Services Clerk at Donald W. Reynolds Library. This tutorial video is the fifth in a six-part series teaching players how to play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Today, I will be teaching you about combat. Combat is a lot more ordered than a lot of things in the Dungeons & Dragons game. There are specific steps that are followed when you participate in combat. The first is to determine surprise. The Dungeon Master determines if any characters are surprised. So, for example, one group manages to ambush another. This is where it determines if those characters were surprised by the ambush. A surprised character can't move or take an action during the first round of combat. The second step of combat is to establish positions. The Dungeon Master decides the location and distance of monsters and characters based on marching order. So this is where you find out where everyone is located and how far apart they are. The third step is to roll initiative. Everyone in the combat rolls initiative to determine the order of the combatants' turns. The fourth step is for each individual to take their turn. So each combatant in the battle takes a turn in the order determined by what their initiative roll was. After everyone has taken a turn, that is called a round. And step 5 is that when one round ends, the next begins. So once everyone has taken their turn, you start over at the beginning with the person who took their turn first and go through everyone's turn again. This continues to happen until the fighting stops. Let's go a little bit more in detail about the difference between the terms round and turn. A round is when all of the players have taken their turn. In the real world, it is the length of time it takes for all participants to actually perform their turn, roll their dice, and take their actions. In the game world, it's 6 seconds. A turn in the real world is the length of time it takes for one single player to perform 6 seconds worth of battle activity. And it also represents 6 seconds in the game world. So even though each person is taking their turn one after another, the actions that they are performing during their turn are actually taking place in the same 6 seconds or during the round of battle. So it's all taking place at the same time. Now let's talk about rolling initiative. Initiative is used to determine the order of turns in combat. The Dungeon Master ranks all combatants from highest to lowest. So each player rolls a dexterity check. So they roll a d20 plus their dex modifier. Those numbers are all compared to each other. Whoever got the highest gets to go first, the second highest next, third highest third, and so on and so forth till you get to the lowest, who would be the last person who gets to take their turn. When a Dungeon Master is telling you to determine your initiative, they will say roll initiative, or they might sometimes say roll dexterity or roll a dexterity check. So your round is 6 seconds. This represents 6 seconds of gameplay activity that is happening. On your turn in this round, you can do the following. You can take one action. So I will go through each action that you can take and what you do for all of those actions later in this presentation. But suffice to say that the action is the one thing you are doing that is taking up the most amount of time of those 6 seconds. You can also take one bonus action. You know if an action can be performed as a bonus action because it will say so in its game description. So under your class or sometimes under a spell, it will be designated that this is a bonus action, so it's something that you can do in addition to your regular action that you've performed. So as well as taking an action and a bonus action, you get to move a certain amount of distance. You can move up to the distance equal to your base speed or your walking speed. You can also talk or gesture. So think of it as you need to do something short and simple, what a character could reasonably say in 6 seconds while they were performing the other actions that they're taking. The last thing you can do that doesn't interfere or use up your action is you can interact with one object or a feature in the environment, so long as that interaction is simple. So you can interact with an object without using your action if it's something you could kind of do in tandem with whatever action you are performing. For example, you could draw a sword, would be interacting with one object. Drawing it and then slashing is something that you could manage to do during one turn. If you wanted to interact with more than one object, or you needed to do a complex movement with an object, that would require you to use up your action. So during the round, you do your turn, and then others are doing their turn too. So while others are doing their turn, they might do something that lets you perform a reaction. A reaction is an action you can take in response to certain stimuli. For example, there are some spells that are considered a reaction that activate when someone does a certain attack against you. You only get one reaction once per round. So for example, if you are everyone's taking their turns and you have multiple enemies, and both of those enemies do an attack that triggers that one reaction you can take, you only get to do it once. Now we're going to go into movement. Movement and positioning are very important during combat. So we're going to take a few slides to figure out all of the details of movement and figuring out where you can move and what you can do in those 6 seconds of a round. So on your turn, without using up your action, you can move a distance up to your speed. So if we were referencing our character sheet that we've been using as an example throughout these tutorial videos, it would have been 30 feet. Would have been your speed, 30 feet per 6 seconds. So you could move 30 feet and still take an action. You can break up that movement between actions. So if you, with that speed of 30, you could move 10, kill your enemy, then move 20 feet. You can also switch between types of movement. So you can change from, you could start out walking and then climb over something and then walk again. And the last thing that you can do is also switch between speeds. So for example, if you were walking and you cast the fly spell on yourself, you could switch over to your flying speed, which means you're covering 60 feet of distance per 6 seconds, for example. Now, we have to talk about how you calculate movement. During combat, it's easier to think of movement in terms of currency rather than speed. Your speed is the amount of movement you have to spend. So, from our example, 30 feet. Walking costs 1 foot of movement per 1 foot of space your character moves in the game world. So it costs 30 feet to actually move 30 feet in the game world. Climbing, swimming, and crawling costs 2 foot per 1 foot of space your character moves, so it requires 30 feet of movement to move 15. Difficult terrain costs 2 foot per 1 foot of movement that your character moves, so it costs 30 feet to move 15. If you have to swim, crawl, or climb through difficult terrain, it costs 3 feet per 1 foot of space your character moves, so it would be 30 feet to move 10 feet. Another thing that might happen is you might be prone. So prone is when you are lying on the ground. You may choose to lie on the ground, but in the most likely scenario during combat is that you have been knocked to the ground during your opponent. In order to attack, you can't be lying on the ground. You have to be able to stand up to perform your gestures if you're doing a spell or something like that. Or standing up, you have to be able to stand up to perform most attacks, such as a melee weapon attack. So dropping prone, for example, if you want to lay down to dodge some sort of attack, doesn't use up any of your movement. But when you stand back up from being prone, it costs half your movement. So if you had 30 feet of movement, you would have to spend 15 to stand up before you could move anymore. One thing you can do while you're prone is you can crawl. Difficult terrain is terrain that is hard for your character to move through. Dungeons and Dragons isn't usually taking place in nice football fields. It's taking place in rough wilderness environments for the most part. So you might have to deal with boulder-strewn caverns, briar-choked forests, treacherous staircases, etc. Every foot of movement in difficult terrain costs 1 extra foot. And remember, if you are performing an action that already costs you additional movement, then when you perform that action or that mode of movement in difficult terrain, it costs you 1 more additional foot of movement. Another thing that has to do a lot with your movement and your positioning on your turn is size. Size is how big a creature is and the amount of space they control. There are 6 categories: tiny, small, medium, large, huge, and gargantuan. Space, or the space that a character controls, is the area in feet that a character controls in combat. It includes their physical dimensions and the reach of their melee weapon reach or their unarmed combat reach. Adventurers typically control a space of 5 feet by 5 feet around them. If you try to fight in a space that is less than the space that you are required by your size, you have disadvantage on your rolls and saving throws, and your movement costs 1 additional foot. Space also has to do with moving around other creatures. So an adventurer can move through a non-hostile creature's space, so you can move within that space where they attack in. But it is considered difficult terrain, and it costs you 1 extra foot of movement per foot of movement you take. Because when you're moving through that space, you're trying to avoid them. So it's difficult terrain. You can't end your turn in another creature's space. You are within melee attack range if your space is touching your opponent's space. So if your 2 spaces are touching, then you are considered within attack range. If you attempt to move out of attack range or attempt to move through the space of a hostile opponent, your opponent gets what's called an opportunity attack, which means they get to immediately attack you even though it may not be their turn. The only way to avoid this is to use the disengage action, which I will talk more about when we talk about actions you can perform during your turn. So let's go back to what is going on, or what we're talking about. We're talking about the things you can do in the 6 seconds of a round you have. So we're going to review those. You can take one action, take one bonus action, move a distance, so we just talked about moving. You can talk or gesture, interact with one object, and then you have one reaction you can use per one round. So now we are going to talk about the actions you can perform on your turn. The actions you can perform during your turn include, you can dash, which is where you gain extra movement, disengage, which is where you avoid opportunity attacks from your opponent. You can dodge, which means you're going on the defensive, help by assisting a party member. You can attempt to hide. You can do what's called a ready action, where you prepare, where you're basically holding your movement, holding your action until someone else does something that triggers your response. You could search for something, interact with an object, or you can attack either by making one melee or ranged attack, or by casting a spell with a casting time of one action. So we're going to go through each of these actions and talk about them in detail. First was dash. A dash action allows you to gain extra movement beyond your base speed. So one of the things you need to note is that your base speed is your walking speed. You can't run without using an action. So when you run, you are using up your action and you are gaining movement. If you remember from our previous tutorial videos, running is 2 times your base speed. So using the dash action is gaining movement equal to your current speed. So you're doubling your movement, which is what running does. The next action you can take is you can disengage. The disengage action allows you to move through a hostile creature's space without provoking an opportunity attack. It lasts until the end of your turn. So if you decide instead of attacking an opponent, you want to get away, you can do that, but you can't attack an opponent and decide to get away. You're using all of your efforts to make sure that they are not able to get an opportunity attack against you. Or I guess another way to think of it is you're not leaving any openings for them to take advantage of. Dodge. When you choose the dodge action, you focus entirely on avoiding attacks. You have advantage on dexterity saving throws, and attack rolls made against you have a disadvantage so long as you can see your attacker. It lasts until your next turn unless you are incapacitated or your speed drops to 0. So in this case, your dodging is when you're choosing to move around and make yourself hard to hit. That's what you're doing for the round. You're just trying to make yourself hard to hit. Help. Help is when you take the help action to aid another creature. You can do this to either try and complete a task. For example, you might be in the middle of a battle, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you are actually attacking your opponents. You might be in the battle and you have the rest of your party members are the ones fighting someone off while you're trying to open up a door or escape a maze or something like that. So you can help with the completion of a task, or you can help by attacking a creature within 5 feet of you. So if you and a party member are both right next to the same creature, you can aid your party member in their attack. When you aid with a task, the creature that you are helping out gets advantage on the next ability check related to the task it performs, but only if it performs that check before your next turn. If you are aiding a friendly creature in attacking an opponent, you do this by distracting or running around or teaming up against the enemy. When you do this, your ally gets advantage when they attack next turn. Or, when they attack before your next turn. And the next action is hide. So, in battle, you may choose to suddenly hide so that you can do more sneaky attacks. To hide, you make a dexterity stealth check. If you succeed, you have advantage on attack rolls against creatures who can't see you, and attackers automatically miss if they target a location you are not located in. So you might use your turn to hide behind a tree, and then next turn you can attack. When you attack after you're hidden, you reveal your location. So you don't have advantage on hiding anymore because you're not hidden. They know where you attacked them from. Cover. Cover are walls, creatures, and other obstacles that make you harder to hit. So when you hide behind something, that something may also give you cover. Half cover is when the obstacle blocks half your body. It gives a +2 to your AC, or your armor class, which is the number that the opponents are trying to beat in order to succeed in damaging you. You also get, when you have half cover, you also get a +2 bonus to your dexterity saving throws. When you have 3/4 cover, which means 3/4 of your body is covered, you get a +5 bonus, and you get a bonus to that +5 to your dexterity saving throws and your armor class. Total cover means that the target can't directly attack you with a spell or melee weapon attack. You can't be hit by anything that they're aiming with you, unless they are doing like a giant spell, like some sort of fire spell, and you happen to be in the area of effect of that spell. So some spells, they could fire behind you, and it could get you from behind because the obstacle isn't preventing you from being hit that way, in that direction. A ready action. You take a ready action when you want to wait for a particular circumstance before you act. So doing so lets you act using your reaction before the start of your next turn. So this is sort of that instead of attacking right during your turn, you are waiting to see what the other people are going to do on their turns. To take a ready action, you announce the circumstance that will trigger your reaction, and the action will take when you react. For example, you might say, if that guy moves towards the door, I'm going to immediately attack him. That would be a ready action. You just described what you're going to do, and you described what will trigger you to do that. Among other reaction options, you can choose to ready a spell, or you can choose to move up to your speed in a response. So you don't have to choose just to attack. You could choose just to move, or move a certain way if someone does something. So you might make this decision during your turn, and then 3 more turns happen and that action that you chose to ready is no longer a good thing for you to do, you can decide to ignore it. You just say that that is what you will do, and you can choose to actually, when the thing that triggers you to do that ready action, you can do it, or you can choose not to. And that ready action only lasts until your next turn. So if you say, I'm going to attack that guy, that only lasts for that 6 seconds. When it comes to your next time, the next time it's your turn again, you have to ready again if you still want to be able to do that. Using an object. Using one object that you can use in tandem with your action does not use your action. So if you remember, that was one of the things you could do. My example was drawing your sword from your scabbard. But if you've already used one object, then you being able to use a second object or using an object that requires more complex movement does use up your action. So, for example, drinking a healing potion is taking it out, pulling it up, and drinking it is a more complex action. It's kind of, sometimes the dungeon master is just the one who specifies whether when you're about to do an action, you just tell them what you're going to do, and you can just ask them, would that count as my action, if you're a little bit unsure. Of course, the best thing that you can do during your action in the middle of combat is to attack an opponent. You can strike them with a melee weapon, fire a ranged weapon from a distance, or use a spell with an attack roll. In all cases, here's what you do. You choose the target within range, be it object, enemy, or just a location you're planning to hit. Then you determine the modifiers. So you determine if anyone has cover or any other advantages. Then you resolve the attack. You actually roll your attack roll and see if you succeed. And you also, if you succeed, you get to roll damage and tell what special effects happen because of your attack. Here's how to attack with a weapon. Step 1, you roll an attack roll. You roll a d20, add your attack bonus, add your proficiency bonus. Step 2, the Dungeon Master informs you you succeed. So the Dungeon Master is comparing your result from your dice roll to your opponent's armor class, and they tell you if you are successful or not. They will not usually tell you what number you are trying to hit. That is something you kind of you don't figure out until you hit them. Step 3 is if you succeeded in hitting your opponent, then you get to roll damage. What dice you roll and how many depends on the weapon that you are wielding. Page 149 in the player's handbook will list all of the damage that each weapon does. If you are using a pre-created character sheet, it will usually have it written under your attacks and spellcasting box on your character sheet. Step 4, the Dungeon Master records the damage. The Dungeon Master subtracts the number you rolled with your damage roll from your opponent's hit points. Now let's go back over an attack roll. The attack roll, which we mentioned earlier, was your rolling a d10 plus your attack bonus. Or I'm sorry, I said d10, I meant a d20 because you almost always roll a d20. A d20 plus your attack bonus. But remember that an attack bonus, if you watched our tutorial video on dice rolls, is your ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus if you are proficient in using that weapon. So it's good to know this because sometimes things affect it so that you may have to recalculate what your attack bonus is in the middle of combat. Now remember, your AC is your armor class. That is how much you have to, if it's your opponent's armor class, that is what you are rolling to hit them. If it's your armor class, it's what your opponent must roll to hit you. They must roll equal or higher than that number to hit you with an attack. So this is assuming, so usually your armor class on your character sheet is calculating, including any armor or shields you normally wear. You will end up in situations of combat where you don't have your armor or shield already on. In that case, you need to understand what your AC is based on what you're wearing. So if you are not wearing your shield or armor when you enter combat, you will have a lower AC than normal until you manage to put on your shield or armor. A shield only takes one action to put it on, so you can use your action during your turn just to put on your shield, and then next turn, after your turn is over, when someone attacks you, your shield bonus will be applied. Armor, however, takes 1 to 10 minutes. So if you think that through, if it takes you 1 minute to put on your armor, and a round is 6 seconds, you would have to use your actions for 6 rounds to put on your armor. So in general, if you don't start out a battle without your armor on, you just go through the entire battle without that armor. So your armor, if you are wearing your armor and shield, your armor class is your armor strength plus your dexterity modifier plus your shield modifier. Your armor strength is a number that is given in a table in the player's handbook, and it is based on what kind of armor you are wearing. If you are not wearing armor or your shield, your armor class equals 10 plus your dexterity modifier. If you are just have your shield on, then your armor class equals 10 plus your dexterity modifier plus your shield modifier. Generally, on your character sheet, you will have written your shield modifier. I recommend you make sure that your character sheet has your armor strength and your shield modifier so that you don't have to look in your book if you suddenly find yourself in combat without your armor or shield equipped or on you. Now let's talk about damage. The damage a creature receives is determined by the source. So there are different types of damage. Certain creatures are less affected by certain types of damage. The amount of damage or number of hit points the creature loses is usually determined by a dice roll. The number and type of dice used when you roll damage is listed on page 149 of the player's handbook when you are using weapons. So to find out how much damage you are doing using your weapon, you can go to page 149 on your handbook, or it's usually written on your character sheet under your attacks and spell casting box. For spells, the type of damage you do is listed under the spell's description. Now, another kind of attack you can do is you can attack without a weapon, which is called hand-to-hand combat. So in order to attack without a weapon, you have to be within range. So that's 5 feet for small and medium creatures. You can do an unarmed strike, which would be a punch or kick or etc. To do that, you would roll the attack roll, which would be a d20 plus strength, or your dex modifier plus your proficiency bonus versus your opponent's AC. So you use the d20 plus strength or dex, your strength or dex modifier, you get to choose, you use whichever one of those is higher for your character. So you get to choose. So it's d20 plus whichever modifier is better, plus proficiency bonus if you have something like your proficient in unarmed combat, and that's compared to your opponent's armor class. The damage you do is 1 plus your strength modifier. Another aspect of hand-to-hand combat would be grappling. So you can grapple a creature, which means you are grabbing them and holding them down. You can only do that if the creature is no more than 1 size larger than you. And to do that, you do an attack roll of strength athletic checks versus your opponent's strength athletic check or dexterity acrobatics check. So basically, it's a comparison roll. You're always going to roll your strength athletics when you're grappling them, and they can use their dex, or well, their acrobatics versus, or their athletics, depending on which one is higher. A grappled creature can use its action on its turn to try and escape. So even though you've got them down, every time they get a turn, they get a chance to try and escape. So that was all of the actions that you could do during, all of the things you could do that would count as an action during your turn of combat. I think because this video is so long, we need to do a review of everything we've covered. So let's go back over it. When you enter into combat, the combat steps are determine surprise, establish positions, roll initiative, and then everyone takes their turn. During a round of combat, you can do the following. On your turn, you can move, talk, interact with one object, take 1 action, and take 1 bonus action. And if the proper trigger happens during that round of combat, you can take 1 reaction. The actions you could take on your turn were to dash, disengage, dodge, help, hide, ready, search. You can use an object, or you can attack. And that's it for part 5 of how to play Dungeons & Dragons. Part 6 will be a tutorial on magical abilities. If you're interested in accessing other programming provided by Baxter County Library, please visit our website, baxlib.org. Happy reading! See you next time.